Dr. Michael Alexeev, thank you so much for finding time to talk with us today at the Kyiv Post. Perhaps you could say a few words about yourself.
Well, thank you for having me on. So I'm an economist. I work at Indiana University. I grew up in Moscow, went to Moscow University, and then I went to Duke University for graduate school and worked at George Mason and now at Indiana. And a big portion of my work, of my research, is about mostly the Russian economy, but also the economies of the former Soviet Union and economies in transition.
So when we talk about economies in transition, how do you see the transition of Russia as well as of Ukraine up until recent times, up until there's such dramatic changes such as warfare? How was their transition?
Well, Russia, I think, did reasonably well in the late 90s, especially after the financial crisis of 98. And the initial reforms in the early 2000s were, I think, very good. But starting, I would say, around 2004, 2005, it was getting worse and worse. Now, Russian GDP still grew because of the price of oil and all that stuff. But in terms of the economic reforms, the transition to a genuine market economy, it was actually going in reverse to some extent. So in fact, to a significant extent. With Ukraine, it was almost the opposite. It did not do well in terms of reforms. In the 1990s, it did even worse than Russia did. But in the last few years, Ukraine actually was getting better. It was still quite far from where it should have been, but the last few years were getting better. It was becoming a more sort of market economy, and I think even corruption was declining. So while in Russia it was actually increasing, and I think if not for the war, I think Ukraine would have been now in really good shape.
Well, let me ask you a personal question. As somebody who is from the region, how do you see the war in Ukraine? What's your interpretation of events there?
Well, I see it as somebody so said in a different context. It is worse than a crime. It is a mistake. So it was a mistake for everybody involved. Everybody. Ukraine, obviously, it's a monstrous thing to do, but it's actually a terrible thing for Russia as well. It is also bad for the world in general. It is hard to see. The only positive thing that I can think of in terms of this war is that maybe it will finally put a nail in the coffin of the idea of Russian Empire. Maybe finally it will become a normal country. There was a paper 20 some years ago, so it was entitled A Normal Country. So it argued that Russia was actually a normal middle-income country. Unfortunately, it was wrong. It is not a normal country. It still has its imperial view, and it's bad for everybody, including Russia. So I hope that the result of this terrible war will be actually that maybe Russia will become eventually a normal country.
Let me ask you another personal question because now I'm curious, I'm intrigued. In this Soviet period, yourself and your family, would you say that they were supportive of the Soviet government?
Oh no. My family was, so it was a family of dissidents. My mother was one of the founding members of the Moscow Helsinki Group. I don't know if you've heard of that organization. Unfortunately, it's being closed as we speak, unfortunately. But no, she was a very well-known human rights activist, and we had no love lost whatsoever for the Soviet government. And actually, she had very close ties with Ukrainian dissidents, so they knew her very well, and many of them stayed at our home in Moscow.
When you look at the situation today in Ukraine, obviously it's dramatically bad what's happened. I mean, with the
Yes.
and the ongoing bombings of the power stations as well as the heating stations. Now, a lot of people sort of, I won't say throw up their hands, but there's a lot of people I think in the West who think, well, there's no way this will ever end. You know, things once a country goes so far down, how can it ever come back? But maybe you can cite from history or from your own knowledge of economics that is there a hope?
Oh, sure. I think actually it might be, so however bad it sounds, it might be in the long run a good thing for Ukraine, because this war actually makes it has increased, it has strengthened the national identity of Ukraine. There were people I heard who had some sympathies, like, for Russia, for Putin and all that, no more as far as I understand. And in terms of the destruction, yes, it's a huge amount of destruction, but I'm sure that the West is going to help a lot with reconstruction, rebuilding, and just look at Germany, look at Japan. The countries were destroyed completely in World War II. Now they are some of the most developed, richest countries in the world, and I hope the same thing is going to happen with Ukraine. I know that a lot of people in the United States and elsewhere are ready to help, and what is maybe even more important, the governments are ready to spend a lot of money for something like Marshall Plan for Ukraine. I hope it will happen. I hope it will happen soon.
If you could say something to the Ukrainian people right now who might see this interview, what would you express to them?
Just my admiration for their certitude, their ability to resist, and their ability to survive and not get down, basically, despite all this this monstrous aggression. And as you said, the attack really on civilians, it's just so awful. But I am very, very impressed by the Ukrainian people. I visited Ukraine many times before 2016 or 2017. My parents were both born actually in Ukraine. So I think it's a great country. It was well under its potential. I hope that after this war, it actually will grow, it will rebuild, and I have great hope for Ukraine, so its economy, and especially its people.
That's fantastic. Well, Professor, thank you so much for your time today, and we appreciate you coming to talk to us here at the Kyiv Post.
Thank you for having me on. Bye-bye.